After spending 100 years frozen in the ocean, a boy who belongs to a long line of avatars awakens and must master the power of the four elements to defeat monstrous creatures and stop the war ravaging his world. Today we're going to recap the first season of the series, Avatar: The Last Airbender, from 2024. During a chase in Capital City, a warrior from the Earth Kingdom must face a group of firebenders in order to escape the kingdom alive. At this point, he is forced to use his skills to defend himself and proves to be an excellent earthbender. Just as he was about to find his partner to escape, the man is hit by a fireball and fights back. Instead of leaving, he gives the secret he stole to his friend and asks him to take the document to the king of the Earth Kingdom, because a war is about to break out. The warrior then erects a wall to prevent the guards from going after his companion and fights alone against an army of firebenders. That night, he is captured and taken prisoner to Sozin. Then, after discovering that the air nomads will be the Fire Lord's next target, the warrior is burned alive. For millennia, the nations of fire, earth, water and air have lived in harmony thanks to the Avatar, who is the only person capable of mastering all four elements and protecting the balance between the kingdoms. When an Avatar perishes, his spirit is reborn in another body, following an eternal cycle. Since the perishment of the last Avatar, the new incarnation has not yet revealed itself, so Sozin takes advantage of this moment to begin his plan to dominate the planet. Knowing that the next Avatar will be born in between the air nomads, the Fire Lord sends his army to eliminate all the airbenders in existence, but one of them has managed to survive. Aang is a 12-year-old boy who lives in a monastery, and his performance as an airbender is far superior to that of other children his age. All the monks already know that the boy has been chosen to receive the spirit of the Avatar, but monk Gyatso says that he is still too young to set off on a journey of learning, with the aim of mastering the other three elements. Even so, the council comes to the conclusion that there is no other choice, because at any moment the Fire Nation will start a war. When he finds out he has to leave, Aang cries because he doesn't want to be separated from all his friends in the air nomads. However, with the help of his master Gyatso, the boy understands the importance of being an avatar and accepts his mission. That evening, Aang goes to visit Appa and they both go for a ride. Neither of them realizes that the army of fire is approaching the monastery with the mission of eliminating everyone they meet along the way. During the battle, the airbenders unite to try to defeat the invaders and, although there are great warriors among them, the Fire Nation has the upper hand, having spent several weeks planning the attack. After incinerating the enemy nation's warriors, Sozin and his army go after the children, who are under Gyatso's protection. While facing one of the greatest airbenders in a duel, the Fire Lord claims that they could survive if, that night, the power of his army wasn't intensified by the comet that is approaching the planet. Thanks to this phenomenon, the Fire Nation wins the battle and eliminates all the airbenders found in the monastery. Unaware that his siblings and sisters are in danger, Aang decides to return home as the ocean that Appa is flying over becomes increasingly rough. However, on the way back, the pair are caught in a storm and fall into the ocean. As his body sinks into the sea, Aang faints and Appa also loses consciousness. At that moment, the Avatar's power is activated and, to ensure that the boy survives, a block of ice is created around him. 100 years later, in Wolf Bay, Katara and Sokka are sailing across a frozen lake when they come across a huge block of ice and out of it comes the Avatar. Seeing Aang unconscious, Katara decides to take him to the village and, upon analyzing the tattoos on the boy's body, her grandmother claims that he is an airbender. At the moment the Avatar awoke, Zuko, the prince of the Fire Nation, was nearby and saw the huge beam of light that was released. Immediately, the boy realizes that the Avatar has awakened and decides to go after him. His goal is to regain his father's trust, because only then will he be able to return home and take his place as heir. When he wakes up, Aang realizes he's not at home and starts flying around looking for Appa. Then, after blowing his whistle, the boy manages to attract the attention of the flying bison, which quickly flies to meet him. After telling the story of how he ended up inside that ice rock, Aang learns that the air nomads have been destroyed and is extremely saddened. In an attempt to console him, Katara reveals that her mother was also eliminated by the firebenders and, 3 years ago, her father left the village with other warriors to hunt them down. Katara is one of the last waterbenders of the southern tribe, as all the others have been eliminated by the Fire Nation. Despite being extremely talented, she doesn't have much freedom to train her skills, because if she is discovered, she risks being eliminated. That day, while showing her powers to Aang, Katara sees a ship approaching and soon realizes that it belongs to the enemy nation. She immediately returns to the village and informs Sokka about the invasion. At that moment, Kanna realizes that the Fire Army is there looking for Aang, who, as well as being the last airbender, is also the Avatar. Upon discovering the boy's true identity, Katara decides to hide him and Sokka challenges Zuko to a duel. Since he doesn't have the ability to control water, the boy is easily defeated and is about to be eliminated when Aang appears and interferes in the battle. With the help of his staff, the boy is able to deflect the attacks of his enemies and, at that moment, the Water Tribe enters the battle. When he realizes that Zuko is going to destroy the whole village, Aang agrees to be taken prisoner to prevent his new friends from being eliminated. However, after the boy is taken away, Sokka and Katara decide to go and rescue him and hitch a ride with Appa to reach the ship. Meanwhile, Aang manages to escape from the cell and runs off with his staff, only to be hit by a fireball and knocked down. Just as he was about to fall into the ocean, the young man is saved by Sokka and escapes with the two siblings. Knowing that he can't return to the village, the trio decide to pay a visit to Aang's old home and, for the first time, the boy has the opportunity to see what the monastery looks like after the Fire Nation's attack. At that moment, he finds the remains of Gyatso and is overcome with emotion. Suddenly, his tattoos start to glow and a cyclone begins to form around him, putting Katara and Sokka's lives in danger. Minutes later, Aang manages to calm down and regains control of his powers. Determined to restore balance to the world, he decides to complete his mission and learn to control each of the other three elements. While walking through the monastery, Aang meets a flying lemur and the animal decides to accompany them on their journey to Kyoshi Island. When they get there, the group is surprised by the Kyoshi warriors and Katara and Sokka end up being captured. At that moment, the eyes of the statue of the old Avatar begin to glow and the locals discover that Aang is the new Avatar. Under orders from her mother, Suki takes the visitors to her quarters and tells them that they can only stay on the island for 48 hours. The next morning, Katara wakes up very early to start training because, before she left, she had received the scroll containing the teachings of the waterbenders from her grandmother. After the training, she helps Aang find information about Avatar Kyoshi while Sokka trains some combat techniques with Suki. When he discovers that the Avatar's spirit resides within him, Aang starts practicing meditation to try to communicate with Master Kyoshi and finally manages to connect with her. While the boy is figuring out what he needs to do to restore the balance between the four kingdoms, an army of the Fire Nation arrives on land and invades the village. The soldiers are met by Yukari, the chief of the tribe, who says she hasn't seen any outsiders on her island apart from Commander Zhao's army. So the man orders his men to search, at which point the Kyoshi warriors decide to act. Soon afterwards, Prince Zuko also arrives on the island with his uncle and Katara has to face him. However, as she is still learning, the girl is defeated and is about to be eliminated when Kyoshi appears. Being close to her temple, the ancient Avatar manages to manifest herself through Aang's body and goes after Zhao. Thanks to her full control of the four elements, she manages to defeat the army single-handedly and the commander has no choice but to retreat. At the end of the battle, Aang regains his true form and is revered by the island's inhabitants, who now have another reason to hope. Before leaving, Sokka kisses her goodbye and Suki gives him her fan as a present. That afternoon, the three friends travel to the Water Tribe in the north, because Aang has been warned that something terrible is about to happen there. After his defeat on Kyoshi Island, Commander Zhao writes a letter to the Fire Lord and informs him of the Avatar's return. That night, Ozai's castle is invaded, but the intruders are caught thanks to Azula, Zuko's younger sister. As a merciless leader, the Fire Lord never spares his enemies and sets fire to their bodies without mercy. Upon arriving in Omashu, the three friends meet a merchant called Jet and ask for his help to enter the fortress, as the soldiers don't usually allow outsiders to pass through. Minutes after crossing the gates, Aang witnesses an explosion and uses his powers to dissipate the smoke. At this point, Teo discovers that he is an airbender and the boy's father invites Katara and the others to take shelter in his house. During a conversation with Sai, the trio discovers that this was just another of the countless attacks carried out by the firebenders, who have spies scattered all over the city. Witnessing the great tragedy caused by the war, Aang decides to postpone his mission to the north and stays in Omashu to help those people. However, that afternoon, Katara sees Sai talking to a spy from the Fire Nation and discovers that he is a traitor. At this point, she meets Jet again and they both decide to follow the Bender through the forest. What they didn't realize was that they were being lured into an ambush and had to face their enemies alone. Realizing that he is at a disadvantage, Jet decides to call on his friends to help him in this battle. Then, a group of young orphans join him and manage to defeat the firebenders. Katara then accompanies the group to a village hidden in the middle of the forest and discovers that this is where they lived. All those orphans had lost their families to the Fire Nation and decided to unite in a fight for freedom. Meanwhile, Teo and Aang investigate those responsible for the attack and discover that the explosion was not caused by firebenders, but by Jet. When she receives this news, Katara tries to defend the boy and goes in search of proof that Sai is the traitor. However, to his surprise, Jet and his friends are already putting their plan to get rid of Sai into practice and exchange his suitcase for a box full of explosive jelly. While trying to convince Jet that this is a terrible plan because innocent people will perish, Katara realizes that Aang was right and asks for her team's help to find Sai. Suddenly, Prince Zuko and Iroh show up to capture Aang, and the boy orders the two siblings to go to the palace while he starts a duel against Zuko. When she gets there, Katara spots one of the orphaned children in a tree ready to shoot the case, so she sends a jet of water to put out the arrow's fire. During the fight against Aang, Zuko attracts the attention of the guards and has to flee, because everyone in the city hates the firebenders. In an attempt to save his nephew, Iroh uses his powers to draw the attention of the soldiers and orders Zuko to flee. During the confusion, Aang also ends up being captured, as he becomes suspected of having caused the arson. While in prison, the boy meets General Iroh again and discovers that, unlike his brother, the firebender is not in favor of war. When he is taken to meet the king, Aang is surprised to discover that this is Bumi, his childhood friend. At that moment, Zuko steals the costume of one of the soldiers in order to infiltrate and save his uncle, who is being taken down the well. After discovering that their friend is trapped in the castle, Katara and Sokka use the underground tunnels to get in and save him. While trying to find their way through the labyrinth, the two siblings come across a monstrous mole guarding the tunnels and have to flee. The pair run until they reach an end, so they have no choice but to accept their eliminations. When Katara and Sokka hold hands, the mole attacks, and the young woman realizes that the animal is blind. All creatures of his species track and react to feelings, especially love. So Sokka manages to convince the mole to help them get into the castle. When he meets the soldiers who are transporting his uncle, Zuko decides to attack them and, even fighting alone, manages to defeat the Earthbenders. He then frees Iroh, and the two of them join forces to defeat the remaining soldiers. After the battle, the general is wounded and Zuko helps his uncle get out of the city. After dinner, Bumi challenges his old friend to a duel, and Aang has no choice but to accept the challenge. The truth is that the king is furious with the Avatar for abandoning him for so many years. He holds Aang responsible for the war, because if the boy hadn't been frozen in the ocean, countless lives could have been saved. Just then, Bumi drops two large rocks and Aang has to use his powers to hold them up, otherwise one of them will be eliminated. The king then orders the boy to make a choice, because being the Avatar means making difficult decisions, but Aang refuses to let Bumi perish. Just then, the two siblings show up and, with Katara's help, Sokka captures the king, so Aang manages to save himself. During a brief conversation, the boy has the chance to make peace with his old friend and discovers that Sai was not a traitor, but a double agent undercover to uncover the secrets of the Nation of Fire. After leaving the palace, Aang and his friends find a village in the middle of the forest and discover that these people have also been attacked by the Fire Nation. The surrounding trees were burned to make way for the mountain, and many of the villagers disappeared when they went out to look for food. Aang then reveals that he knows the whereabouts of these people and says that he will go after them. While walking with his friends through the forest, the boy reveals that he has felt the presence of a barrier that leads to the spirit world, where he believes the villagers are trapped. Minutes later, the trio find an altar built in honor of the forest spirit, and Aang sits down on a rock to meditate. However, instead of reaching the spirit world alone, the boy accidentally ends up taking his friends with him, and the team encounters the spirit of knowledge, which resembles a giant owl. This spirit guides Aang to find the wise man who lives in a stone house and asks him to be very careful, as there are creatures there that could pose a danger to his friends. Minutes later, the trio come across the forest spirit and Aang realizes that he is wounded. During the attack, the youngsters end up separated and each of them has to relive their most painful memory. While Katara and Sokka experience the darkest moments of their lives, Aang arrives at the stone house and meets the spirit of Gyatso. Just then, the monk reveals that there is a monster hiding in the fog. The creature is called Ko, and it has taken all the villagers to its lair, as well as Katara and Sokka. Gyatso tells him that an ancient incarnation of the Avatar was once able to defeat Ko, and in order to access it, Aang will have to infiltrate the Fire Nation, because that's where Roku's temple is. So the boy leaves his friends in the care of Appa and Momo, and picks up his staff to fly to his next destination. In an attempt to speed up their search for the Avatar, Zuko and Iroh decide to hire a mercenary to track him down, as June has a creature capable of sniffing out anything. When he arrives at the Fire Lord's castle, Aang is helped by a guard to reach the temple, and the boy manages to get in touch with his ancestor. In doing so, he discovers that Roku has stolen a totem representing Ko's mother and decides to try to make a trade to get his friends back. However, before he could leave the palace, Aang was surprised by the arrival of June and her beast, who managed to paralyze him with its saliva. Later, he wakes up in a cave and Zuko and Iroh show up to take him back to the palace. However, during the journey, The pair end up being surrounded by Zhao's army, which has been promoted to admiral, and Zuko has to deliver the avatar to him. After capturing their target, Zhao and his men have a night of celebrations and don't even realize that the fortress has just been invaded by a masked enemy. After defeating the fire-bending soldiers, the mercenary manages to reach the dungeon and free Aang. Then they both flee across the rooftop, but end up being spotted, and the boy has to manifest his powers to ward off his opponents, while the mercenary uses his swords to eliminate all the fire-benders that approach. When he realizes that he is surrounded, he puts Aang up as a shield, because he knows that Zhao needs the boy alive. Then, when the masked man threatens to eliminate him, the admiral orders his subordinates to open the gates, and the pair manage to escape from the fortress. When they are both a few meters away, Zhao orders one of the archers to eliminate the mercenary, at which point Aang discovers that it was Zuko who freed him. Even though he knows it will be easier to escape alone, the boy decides to take the prince with him to prevent him from becoming a prisoner. That night, while they are both hiding in a cave, Aang discovers that the burn on Zuko's face was caused by his own father, as punishment for the prince opposing his evil plans. After putting Zuko on a boat, Aang bids him farewell and says that if they had met 100 years ago, they could have been great friends. The prince then has the chance to row back to his ship, and Iroh is extremely relieved to see him. Hours later, Aang returns to the forest and connects to the spirit world to try to negotiate with Ko. In exchange for his mother's totem, the cursed spirit frees his prisoners and, as well as recovering his friends, Aang also saves the villagers who were lost. In the morning, Zuko is hastily woken up by Lieutenant Ji and discovers that there is a search warrant out for him. Somehow, Zhao discovered that it was the prince who had freed the Avatar and managed to convince the Fire Lord to turn against his own son. To avoid being captured and put on trial, Zuko has to flee, but soon discovers that this was just a trap set by Zhao to get rid of him. The boy's boat is full of explosive jelly and, during the escape, one of the Admiral's archers shoots an arrow to blow up the ship. The next day, Aang and his friends finally reach Agna and meet the chief of the tribe. Happy to welcome the Avatar to his land, Arnook introduces him to Master Pakku and Princess Yue, the tribe's spiritual leader. However, before starting his training, Aang decides to go to the temple to connect with Avatar Karuk and asks for his help in defeating the fire army that is about to invade. However, unlike Avatar Kyoshi, Karuk refuses to take part in this battle and says that Aang will have to learn to fend for himself. Since arriving in that city, Katara has become an apprentice to the Master Yugoda and has learned how to use water to heal any kind of injury. However, when she discovers that the women of the tribe are forbidden to use their powers for combat, the young woman rebels and decides to confront Master Pakku. However, the old man says that Katara will have to follow the traditions of the people and will not be able to take part in the battle. In an attempt to prove that she is worthy of the fight, the girl decides to challenge Pakku to a duel and proves to be very talented, despite never having had a master to teach her. However, even with her great skill, Katara is unable to beat the old man and has to admit defeat, but she manages to win the respect of Pakku and the other young waterbenders. Seeing the Fire Nation approaching, the three friends hitch a ride with Appa and fly to the ship to try and defeat them. The numerical disadvantage does not prevent them from destroying a large part of the ship, which is enough to slow down the enemy's voyage. However, when they cross the clouds, the young warriors discover that there is a large fleet on its way to the city of Agna, which means that the battle is practically lost. On one of those ships is Zuko, who managed to survive the explosion and now, more than ever, is determined to capture the Avatar so that he can return home. Knowing that the city is in great danger, Katara not only decides to fight but asks the other waterbenders to join her, and Master Pakku has no choice but to accept the warriors' participation in the battle. On that night of the full moon, known as the Ice Moon, Admiral Zhao is planning to eliminate the spirits of the moon and the ocean, which only take physical form once a year. At that moment, Karuk's spirit appears to Aang and the boy is informed of the Admiral's intentions. He immediately warns Katara about his discovery and they both go off to find Sokka and Yue. Suddenly, Zuko appears and Katara orders her friend to go ahead while she holds the prince. Soon after, Aang finds his friends and informs them of Zhao's evil plan. By now, the man has managed to find the two carp that received the spirits and catches the fish that represents the spirit of the moon. Immediately, the moon turns red and Aang tries to negotiate with the Admiral to get him to release the carp. With Iroh's help, the boy frees the fish from Zhao's hands, but before the Avatar can return the carp to the lake, the Admiral uses his knife to eliminate it. At that moment, the Water Tribe is weakened and the Benders lose their powers and are easily defeated by the enemy army. When the Fire Benders invade the city, the king and his masters must retreat while the army fights a hand-to-hand battle with the enemy soldiers. In an attempt to save that world, Aang merges with the spirit of the ocean and uses his own body as a channel to summon it. Furious at the harm done to the moon spirit, the monster directs all his fury towards destroying his opponents. Meanwhile, Zuko spots Zhao trying to escape and challenges him to a duel. After defeating the traitor, the prince decides to let him live, but is about to be struck in the back when Iroh appears and eliminates the admiral. When he arrives at sea, the monster destroys all the enemy troops' ships. When the battle comes to an end, Aang is unable to regain control of his body. Instead, he remains connected to the spirit of the ocean who is destined to wander for eternity in search of his lost partner. Determined to calm this vengeful spirit and restore the balance between day and night, Yue, who received the life force of the moon spirit as a child, decides to sacrifice herself to bring the carp back to life. Just then, the moon returns to the sky and, upon seeing it, the ocean spirit calms down. With Katara's help, Aang manages to regain consciousness and becomes the Avatar again. At the end of the war, the people gather the bodies of the warriors who sacrificed themselves in battle, and Aang is heartbroken to see all the destruction that has been caused. Luckily, his friends are always there to support him and guarantee that they will help him fulfill his mission to bring peace back to the world.